do that. Okay, do that. Okay. And I don't want to run over. I'd like to kind of just get into the presentation here, because I think we have a lot of material to present and to discuss. Okay. So I think everyone has been participated once before. Is that correct? Or is there someone who's not?
Jason Mewis has not participated yet. Jason Mewis, I'm an engineer in Canada, in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. I own a heavy industrial resource sort of engineering firm here. We do multidisciplinary engineering for mining and minerals and heavy industrial applications. We have a pretty well-established cost consulting group within our engineering team, and one of my specialties is cost and schedule risk analysis that I've been developing experience and expertise in for over 15 years now. I do it generally on capital projects for the mining and resource sector. We do full integrated cost and schedule models, including discrete risk events. We facilitate the full gamut of collecting the information for those models and building up the model itself and running simulations and analysis and results for the customers. Sometimes those expand into the cash flow model and supporting the finance team on the business case for those projects. Yeah, that's I guess a fairly quick synopsis of my experience and expertise here.
Well, that's good, because I think we've got several people here that have got expertise in this CSRA, and I think one of the things I envisioned when starting this group is that there were different views of how to go about doing it, and the idea was to be able to share those different views and maybe people come up with something better than what they already have. So thanks for sharing that, Jason. Okay, so what I'd like to do today is I say types of CSRAs here. And Quentin sent me some information, and from that we've kind of expanded it to talk about these types. And we'll spend probably most of this session talking about types of CSRAs, and Quentin's going to make a presentation on JCL. And then we can get into the sorts of projects justify CSRA and when they should be conducted. And then we'll get into next webinar and topics. Okay. So I think we'll see this before, but basically the issue is that there is uncertainty in both the schedule and the cost, and deterministic estimates tend to be, in the P5 to P10 range, if not even lower, if that's what you use. And so the question is, how do you get more of a realistic estimate? Assuming management wants it, by the way. I mean, that's one of the things you need to work on. So when I think about types of CSRAs as actually defined in this document that Quentin sent me, I think it was a NASA document, but they talk about PERT, which is Program Evaluation Review Technique. They say it's just expert judgment, but I think I viewed PERT as having lots of different flavors to it. Some of them could be deterministic, others could be probabilistic. Then there was something called the Freeman Economist, which was a strange one. I don't know a whole lot about it, but basically I think it's saying you don't know what you don't know, and therefore just assume a 30% probability of some unplanned event, but then it becomes a question of, well, unplanned, how big is an unplanned event? And is that for every node that you might have in your PERT diagram? And then there's something called quantify everything. And then there's this JCL, Joint Conference Level probabilistic calculator, at least that's the way I saw it. And Quentin will talk quite a bit about that. And I think that's great. This website, I'll send you this later, but about 20 minutes into this video, it starts to get good stuff, okay? And then the other thought is just adjust estimates based on some historical experience. So It's down here. We've got this cartoon. He says, my historical experience is that everyone wastes 1 week. Well, that's not true. Just schedule a meeting with me, and then you find out that he's not going to be available for a week. So I thought that was kind of cute. Anyway, so in a PERT relationship, I think most people know this. Kind of you got these activities that you need to do, and oil and gas. Several of you are involved in oil and gas here. You got some front-end engineering, you got to get permits, you got detailed engineering, you got to buy some stuff, you got to build a platform of pipelines, you got multiple things here that have to be completed before I can sign off. Things get split this way as precedents. And so anyway, you kind of build one of these things up, and then you can do your CSRA. And I think many of us may have models that utilize something like this, and maybe I'm hoping maybe the next meeting we can start sharing some of those models online to give a flavor for how they work. That said, I would like to turn this over to Quentin and let him talk about the joint confidence interval.
And I'm glad to hear there are some fellow people online who's been, especially as far as mining is concerned, doing integrated cost schedule risk analysis. And if you don't mind me sort of leading straight, I know that we're stuck for time. You can't describe. I don't think you can describe joint confidence level as a process. It's more sort of an outcome or a metric that, as you're all aware, that Monte Carlo, or that the NASA guys came up with. There's a long lead into the whole thing. Simply saying that in a project, time is money. It's as simple as that. And they needed to have a look at what is the joint probability of hitting both their cost and their scheduled targets. You can imagine in space missions, not that I've done any, but I can imagine that they're working on very tight timelines in terms of launch windows, etc., etc. The difficulty with that sort of thing is typically, if you want to go faster, it costs you more. That's typically the kind of solution, or at least as far as mining and minerals is concerned. So it's derived by means of Monte Carlo simulation from a project cost loaded schedule. That's also got a risk element overlaid on top of it, where your risk activities, your discrete, your project specific, and your systemic risks are mapped to the activities that are affected by the risk or the uncertainties. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see that the summary output typically shown in the form of a JCL chart. Brian, if you wouldn't mind just clicking over to the next one.
Yep, we'll do. Here, let's see. There we go.
All right, I'm not seeing it yet, but I would think, there we go. Okay, so this is what everybody's used to. This is not the JCL itself. What you have here is your typical breakdown. On the left-hand side, you have your finish date at a P50 level, and on the right-hand side, the cost at a P50 level. These are straightforward example files because I can't get them, or I haven't bothered to ask for client permission to share some of the models that I've done for them. The difficulty with these two things is that clearly it doesn't show time is money, specifically in a project sense. And I think that is part where the JCL, or the motivation for JCL as a metric, came from. And if we click over to the next slide, we see the same results actually represented in a joint confidence level graphic. Scatter plot shows you at the 50% level, exactly the one that we've just seen. And if Brian wouldn't mind, there's a little yellow dot in the left-hand quadrant over there. That shows you the actual deterministic point in the left-hand quadrant at the bottom. That's what we planned to do. That's what we thought it would cost. We now added risk, uncertainty to the whole thing, and ran the Monte Carlo. I think this was about 5,000 iterations, just for the sake of an example. And each of those green dots represent a result, a possible result at various levels of probability. And if you look at the left-hand bottom corner of the left-hand quadrant, you see that at this stage, that shows that there's a 50% likelihood or 50% probability of us hitting both or hitting, after we've adjusted for risk, our deterministic budgets that's been adjusted by risk. and you can see the delta between your deterministic number, both for duration and cost. That's typically your contingency. Is this risk averse? Is this risk neutral? Is this the right level at which projects would want to go and do final investment decision or do approve for construction? That depends on the risk tolerance, the risk appetite, the risk criteria, whatever you want to call it, of the project owner at the end of the day. Typically, my advice is usually, especially where a project owner has a portfolio of projects or perhaps a program of projects, where there's a bit of a portfolio effect you would go for the P50, but then you would go for sort of a management reserve held outside of the project, the delta between a P70 and a P50. That's really a call that you have to make at that point in time.
Quentin,
you were asking?
Quentin, just as a clarification, you're saying if I was going to do this, I would give them this point where the hairlines are crossing. They give them that schedule and that cost, right?
Well, yeah, any of the green dots represents a possible outcome at a P50 joint confidence level.
Yeah.
In other words, I'm not sure which one of those green dots actually represents the final outcome of your project. But what I can say is that I'm 50% confident that one of those green dots, right, your project cost and duration will be one of those green dots or less than the uppermost dot, for lack of a better word, in the bottom left-hand quadrant. If you go to the next slide, maybe that's a better description of what we had here. If I remember the next slide, there was a little bit more of a fancy. Yeah, that's just the one. We've now adjusted to a P70. If you look at the bottom left-hand quadrant, you'll see right in the corner there is a P70 level, and you can see how the contingency numbers have moved, both in terms of duration and cost. If we go to the next slide again,
Clinton, when you say, if I was going to quote the contingency here, what would you quote as an answer?
Well, that would be the delta between, if you were going to approve your project at a P70 level, that would be the delta between your deterministic number and your P70 for cost and for duration.
Okay, so the contingency and cost would be from this yellow dot up to this black line.
Yeah, but you see, in terms of cost, if you look at the cost, the singular probability or the confidence level for cost, that's actually sitting at a 92%. Now, that is typically, you can see that the 92 for cost and the 70 for duration is going a little bit out of whack. That means that this project is probably a bit schedule constrained. In other words, it's schedule driven. That's why if you want to go quicker, we're going to have to add more cost, and that's why your cost number now starts kicking up, because risk events or systemic uncertainty or project specific risk is driving your schedule, was driving your cost estimate to hit a specific schedule constraint date. That's why you're seeing the two going out of whack. The bottom line, what NASA tried to accomplish at the end of the day, from my understanding, and I'm not an expert on the way that NASA does it, they wanted to say, we need to, for the purposes of funding, have a number, a P70 number, both in terms of cost and in terms of schedule, that will tell us at what level should we be approving our projects, given the mission critical status of their typical projects. If you go to the next slide, you'll then see that they've come up with something called an efficient, or not an efficient frontier, that's the wrong word for it, but they sort of, I'm trying to find the right description of it, but the analysis level, you see that blue curve that is sitting there. You can see at the left-hand bottom quadrant, it's a 70%, just over 70%, and that blue curve represents their frontier, their investment frontier, in terms of the NASA projects. This actually comes out of a NASA, I think it's Annexure J of their cost estimating handbook, and you can see how the two cost and the schedule elements are slightly out of whack. In other words, you have for cost at the bottom, I think that's an 80%, and at the top you'll see for schedule, if I'm not mistaken, they've got an 82% confidence level. And that blue line represents the J70 curve at which they will represent or we say will approve. I think of notice here is how far in the left-hand corner that actual deterministic result is. If you look right to the left, you see how far that is. And you asked about the delta, or you asked about the contingency. You can see here that if they were to go to I think it's probably about a P50. You see in terms of cost, they're adding another 100 million to their deterministic results. That's the sort of the little arrows that's showing on the left-hand side there, just above or just left of the deterministic result. That's the sort of contingency, and I think that was about at a P50, looks like, can't be P70. But if you look at the right hand, and if you look at the horizontal axis, they needed another 200 days on this particular one to hit that P70 joint confidence level. Any questions on this graphic? Because I find when I present this is typically the first graph that I present when I do an integrated cost schedule risk analysis and I have to report back to the investment committee or to the board or to whatever. I put this in front of them and they all freak out. And I'm not surprised, because it can get a bit messy unless you go and you rationalize as to how the two things fit together. Any questions about this at the end of the day? Thank you. Let me just say that if your board member, if your investment committee member understands the importance of this particular graphic, you can actually just forget about reading the rest of the report. This tells you everything that you need to have. The risk manager, the project team, they will take care of the risk drivers, etc., etc. But this graphic sort of should give any board member who's got a bit of insight into it the confidence that you've done the analysis and all the rest. Of course, now if we go to the next slide,
well,
there are a few.
Whoa, let me ask a question. You talked about the blue line as being like an efficient frontier. Of course, I always think about that as being risk. So something here is being held constant, I guess. And then you're trading off and saying, given that whatever that metric is, these are different combinations of cost and schedule that equalize. So what is being equalized in this blue line?
No, there's nothing being equalized. Those are possible outcomes, possible results that will fall within a 70%. That will go to that will make sure that the left-hand indicator there, the 70%, that remains constant. Any number where if those two crosshairs hit any area on that curve, the 70% should remain in place.
Okay, so this is, if I start to adjust these lines, this percentage down here changes, and you're saying if I did these crosshairs at, let's say, this point up here, it would also read 70%.
And thereabouts, yeah, more or less.
Yeah. Okay. So that's what's being held constant as I build this quote efficient frontier.
Yes, and to some extent, you know, I must admit here, I've never tried to do it, and I actually warn against it. I think it's wrong to use the JCL as a method by which to sit there and play little games with the crosshairs to trade off cost against schedule or vice versa. I've never been asked to do that. I've never tried to play those games, but I think that is what the rationale is behind that blue line. For lack of a better description, efficient frontier, it's not the right term, but for the purpose of this discussion.
I think it's a really good, I think it's a good concept, because it then tells the project manager or executives, look, if you're not happy with this kind of a schedule, this is the kind of cost increases you're going to have to incur in order to move to this kind of a schedule with a 70% confidence.
That's right, and you'll see, and the bottom line is that yes, you're now starting to do the trade-off. Whether that trade-off is in fact gives you the correct or gives not a correct, there's no such thing as correct. It gives you a realistic answer. That's a different question. This particular graph was produced by a piece of software called Polaris by Bruce Allen Hamilton. Very good kit, very nice kit. I'm an old Primavera risk analysis perp master man, so I tend to stick with what I know. I can't do this in perp master, but this is a piece of kit that comes up that's been very highly rated by people far more knowledgeable than myself in the industry.
Yeah, well, actually, I saw you showed me this graphic, and I took this graphic and replicated it in my CSRA using SIP math, and it was not difficult to include getting these percentiles. So Yeah. Okay. We can talk about that maybe next meeting.
Look, the piece of kit is called Polaris by Booz Allen Hamilton, or Booz, yeah, a Canadian firm. It's Polaris.
Any other questions or comments on this slide from folks?
Can we move on to the next slide? It's just a few concluding comments, just to sort of wrap things up. You can see now what they've tried to do, the NASA guys here. They tried to move their decision-making from deterministic right through, all the way through 2003, started to do the separate cost schedule risk analysis, realized at some point in time that, guys, we need to fit the two together. They need to run together. And that's where you head up now in 2010. You get to the sort of the integrated cost schedule risk analysis that Dr. David Hewlett, he's my mentor. I learned my trade from Dr. Hewlett. He was the big driver around integrated cost schedule risk analysis, wrote books on it. The AACE's recommended practice 57R, that documents the not just the JCL, but the entire integrated cost schedule risk analysis methodology. I know my learned colleague who's also on the call here can maybe agree or disagree with me. I'd love to hear your comments on it. But if we can move to the next slide, just in terms of the general process that one would typically go through. Brian, just click over. You had that other little timeline in there. So we would collect all of our risk data. Especially as far as mining is concerned, if it's got a bit of a process plant involved, for systemic risk, I like the AACE distinction between project-specific and systemic risk. Project-specific typically comes out of your risk register. There's no big shakes about that. Systemic risk element, a lot of parametric data if they have that available, but typically we go and build mines in a new geology, etc., etc. So I like to sort of put in place things like the PDRI from the Construction Industry Institute. I like to use those kinds of tools, or the Hackney model when it comes to process plants. I like to use those kinds of tools to get a handle on systemic risk. So we collect the risk data, we collect the schedule data, add the whole lot together. We do a summary schedule. You know, there's no ways in God's green earth that you can use a 50,000 line integrated master schedule out of all of your disciplines and run a risk analysis on it. So a big part of my job when I go and do QRAs for companies, I would sit down with the planner, the scheduler, the project manager, the risk manager about 2-3 days before the actual workshop session. And then they go through the pain of cost loading that schedule. First of all, making a sort of a high-level schedule, not just a summary, but a high-level schedule that sort of still shows the deterministic critical path through the schedule. But then at a higher level that we cost load, we get our control accounts all sorted out. And you can imagine, you guys who have been in the game for a long time, you can imagine there's a bit of pain on their part. We look at the risk register, we overlay that, and of course in the workshop, we then run the model and we get our results as far as the cost and schedule is concerned, our tornadoes. But most importantly, and this is where NASA was ending up with, was to say we need to be confident at a 70% level of both cost, of hitting both our cost and our schedule objectives. Now, typically in industry, we don't have that kind of money lying around. We also want to talk about capital efficiency. So we would go and typically go and approve a project at a P50 level. And if we're a little bit worried about the risk profile, or if the project owner is a bit risk averse, we would keep a management reserve, which again is also specified by the AACE at a sort of a portfolio level, a delta between the P50 and the P whatever they decide on. If we go to the next slide, if you don't mind, and I realize I'm running out of time.
No, you're all right. You're all right. You're all right.
Okay. Right. It's a representation. That's why I said let's not call it a process, or let's not make it what it's not. It's not this wonderful panacea that's going to give us more accurate or optimal cost and schedule estimates. It is just a graphic representation of the scenario, the possible scenarios in one nice graphic that says, guys, there's a trade-off to be had between cost and schedule. If you want to be able to hit both, these are the kinds of contingency, both in terms of time and in terms of cost, that you need to look at the end of the day. And of course, the nice part about it, it shows us how our unexpected events, our risk, our uncertainties, how that affects that particular contingency and how it contributes to it. If we can go to the next slide. Yeah, so summary indication, and it acknowledges, in my view, the fundamental independent nature of the cost and the schedule objectives. I don't like to, and I would not suggest that anybody uses a JCL, moving those little markers around to do time and cost trade-offs. It does inform you, it does inform the typical debate that you would have. Is this schedule driven? Is this cost driven? I'm in Qatar next week. We're doing the lessons learned because all the girls who's doing the 2022 World Cup in Qatar, they've now come back from Russia. I hope they had a hell of a good time because I was working. We're going to do a lessons learned. And now you're going to find that their schedule is not the issue. Schedule is a given. So now it's the whole cost debate that we need going to have to start off next week and see where they go off with. So JCL, I think in my opinion, and sorry, not in my opinion, I would agree with the Auditor General of NASA in his report on JCL, that it's not so much about the graphic and about the 70% about the numbers, but it's about the level of scheduling and the level of costing that is required to support the rigor of an integrated cost schedule risk analysis. I think we just do so much better work by forcing people not into a straitjacket, but by forcing them to say, this is our final output that we need to have for decision making. We need to up our game as far as schedule and as far as cost estimates are concerned. And I think then we are achieving, if we are able to schedule, and if we're able to do risk analysis at this level, and I haven't come across, with the greatest of respect, too many people in the world actually doing it to this kind of level. But if we can get to this point, I think then risk analysis and cost schedule risk analysis really trying to achieve the ultimate objective, which is decision quality. And that's, I think, what we're all about at the end of the day. I'm not sure whether I have a last slide. I can't remember. I did this on the plane coming back this afternoon. Just click again if you don't mind. Oh yeah, just some reference material. The two ones in red, as far as I'm concerned, the AACE one, as far as I'm concerned, that's the locus classicus when it comes to this kind of thing. And it talks specifically about JCL in that as a final outcome of integrated cost schedule risk analysis. A more recent one, and it's a very nice description, very nice bedtime reading, Steinman and Donovan's article in the latest issue of Cost Engineering. And I'm happy if anybody wants to send me a mail, or I can send this off to Brian and he can distribute it to the group. The Steinman one, the ASC one, I wouldn't want to send around because that's restricted to members of the ASC. But the Steinman and Donovan one, I'm perfectly happy to send off to Brian and he can distribute to the rest of the group.
I wrote down like 4 questions, but let's check. I'd like to get, I mean, it's somewhere in here. I'd like to get Jason's views of what he's saying here, because he introduced himself and been doing this for 15 years, I think he said, or maybe it was 20, and to get his thoughts on it.
Yeah, this is Jason. That is very enlightening. Thank you for that, Quentin. I have not seen JCL before, but I can see the picture, and it's got me thinking about how to integrate that into our models and our outputs for our customers. It would make a lot of sense to be able to show that. I've never thought about that reality, that the level of confidence of your cost estimate and schedule may not give you the same overall integrated level of confidence. So that scatter plot makes a ton of sense to me now that you've gone through this process. So I'm gonna try to play with that on my next project and see if I can get that built. I typically do all of my integrated models in Excel using at-risk, including scheduling. I used to use an external or at-risk for project when it came to the scheduling portion for models, but I find I get a lot more control with the building a model in Excel. So I think I could probably replicate something, maybe not as with sliders and something as fancy as what you've got shown here on the screen right now for from Polaris, but I'll look into that as well and see what that application does. But very interesting stuff, and I'm looking forward to giving this a shot.
Excellent. I contract you to Palisade, and this is totally doable with the scatter plot functionality that's sitting in at risk, you're on exactly the right track. If you just play around with it a little bit, maybe give me a shout. This is totally doable inside at risk.
Really? Okay.
So one of the things, let me ask a question here, and then I'm sure there are others on the phone that have questions, but at what level of granularity do you have either the task to be performed or the cost elements? I mean, I think of Primavera as being something, okay, you're using this in, I'll call it chip dip phase 4, you're actually doing the development, and you've got a program manager that's got, 2,000, 5,000 elements. But somehow I don't think that's the right answer if you're trying to do a cost and schedule risk analysis. So what are your thoughts there?
My view has always been this: as you rightly point out, there's two schools of thought here. Use the entire bloody thing as is after you've checked it through DCMA and all the rest. That's Colin Cropley out in Australia. He likes to use that. I think it's a waste of time, and there's no ways in God's green earth that I can get a group of people sitting down and working and assigning probabilities and likelihoods and impact ranges to 5,000 or whatever items. I like to do a level 2. In some instances, even a level 3 kind of schedule. When I say level 3, or even perhaps, level 3, it's if the risk that have been identified, whether it's project specific or systemic, if the risk warrants that in a particular work package, we need to drill it down to a lower level, then let's do that. Let's keep the network logic going, all right, because obviously that's where your network logic comes from. But I have yet to, and I've also been at this around 15 years, I've yet to come across a project manager who at the end of my 2 or 3 days where they sweated blood to try and get their schedule in a logical format that the network makes sense to the planner and to the scheduler. And the cost guy has now sweated, and he's now split his cost into time dependent and time independent, and he's allocated it, and I've forced him to demarcate the control accounts that's going to go into his SAP or into his whatever financial system he wants to run. I have yet to come across a project manager who's not yet said to me that said, I now for the first time have a one-page view of what this project is all about, and I can see where the risks are coming in. So in terms of fidelity, if in a mining job, let's use a mining job. So in engineering, they're going to introduce a specific new piece of technology, like a new PLC. First question from my side as a risk guy, where's this been used before? Where's the reference site? Oh no, it's a pilot, it's brand new, just came out, etc. I say, well, my friend, that is so uncertain. So then I will map that down in terms of a schedule, literally down to maybe even a level 4, because I need to account for that risk and the effect of that uncertainty that it might have on my schedule or duration. At the end of the day, level 2 works for most instances. Most cases, or in some cases, you need to go down to a level 3. And if there's a specific risk that affects a specific discipline or a specific aspect of the project, you might even go down to a level 4 for that particular area, not for the entire thing, for that particular area. Because your job, or sorry, my job, is to look at the effect of uncertainty on objectives. And in this instance, these are one-trick pony kinds of apps. They can only, at risk, can model any decision. I agree with Jason. You get a lot more fidelity out of it. The Polarises of this world, the PERT Masters of this world, Safran, etc., they're all one-trick ponies. They do cost and schedule very well, but that's all they do. Nothing more, nothing less.
Hey, Bill Haskett, do you have some thoughts here?
Yeah, I'm looking at the swarm, and I deal with a lot of swarms in unconventional uncertainty management, and it's making me think more about what elements can we capture in a cost and schedule expert interview situation that could move the entire swarm, as opposed to looking at dissecting the swarm. And I'm just toying with those ideas. So this is very useful, good fodder for thought.
May I just say, I tend to sort of, these are not my ideas. I've read through Annex J of the NASA cost estimating handbook. I've read through their various reports, etc. Like I said, my training came from Dr. David Hewlett, who wrote the book on integrated cost schedule risk analysis and the primary author of 57R from the ASCE. So maybe I'm suffering from a little bit from confirmation bias. I'm perfectly happy to admit that. But I've yet to come across a better solution at this particular point in time. In terms of a final output when you have to put it in front of the decision maker. The difficulties that I've had to present this, and I'll say this, well, I can say this on the record, it's over and done with. I had to present in 2013, I had to present on a natural gas project that I did for Gazprom in Russia, but the meeting was, the project office was in Amsterdam. I walked into the meeting and the chairman of Gazprom at that stage probably still is Vladimir Putin. So I got a lesson in humility in 10 seconds flat, and to my great detriment, I had this JCL right up front and center as my pièce de résistance. This is what we're going to talk about. And it took me, Einstein said, if you can't explain it simply, you don't understand it well enough. I literally had to say, if you were to ask yourself the question, at what level would you be confident that you can hit both your cost and your scheduled targets for this particular pipeline? Because you have an agreement with 7 of the European or Southern European countries to supply them with liquid gas by a specific date. So schedule is a little bit tight. Cost, you're able to wiggle a bit. What level would you look at? And he said, and he gave me a number, and we literally put the crosshairs on that number, so that the bottom left-hand quadrant showed that number that he gave. And I said, well, in that instance, this is the kind of contingency required in terms of estimate and in terms of cost and in terms of schedule. And immediately he tweaked on it, and we literally did not have to go past any of the further discussion. He wasn't worried about the risk or anything like that. The CRO, they worried about that thing. But he immediately tweaked on it and said, this is totally doable. This is within the sort of the area that we would think in terms of going forward with the project. And it's simply because we had this graphic up front, which looked terrible in the beginning. I like your word, Bill, you call it a swarm. I've never thought about it like that. It looks terrible, but once you understand the magic of the JCL, and you can communicate that to the client in terms of his investment decision, I think then you've done very well. The difficulty getting to this point is the rigor involved in your schedule and in your costing. And I think that is not a bad thing to do. To put a bit of fire underneath the schedulers and the cost estimators of this world, that is not a bad thing at all, because you need that rigor to go into this little graph.
Yes, I'd like to understand more about the mechanics of doing that ISO confidence line, but that's probably for a different time rather than here.
Oh, I don't think that's I mean, from my perspective, it's not difficult at all. Because if you say, I want to move, you move this schedule line over a little bit, and then you say, okay, if I move the schedule over a little bit, then this doesn't go to 70%, because this is a 70% confidence. So if I move this line over to the left, now I have to move the cost line up a bit in order to get this back to 70, and that gives me another data point.
And that's exactly right. I personally do not like to play that kind of trade-off, because to me, I don't know what the timing of the cash flows. You might just, for that sort of long duration out there, you might just have a hammock activity that sits there where you're not actually spending too much time-dependent work, but time-independent cost. Time-dependent cost. But time-independent costs are just sort of humming away in the background. The hamster wheel keeps on turning. The hamster's left a long time ago, but the hamster wheel keeps on turning. And I'm worried about playing those kinds of trade-off games. I would much rather go model a particular scenario with its risk included, run the JCL or run the analysis, get the JCL out and say, under these circumstances, this is my approximation of your reality, because that's all it is. It's an approximation of the project reality.
Okay, David, you trying to talk in here?
Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment. Having been on the other side of the table with a lot of project management, and the reality is, the thing I like about this swarm, as Bill called it, is that in reality, once you get into a project, you really can't affect the schedule much by throwing money at it, but you can't really save money by changing the schedule. In other words, it is what it is. All you can do is manage it as best as you can once you get into it. It's really hard for the managers, especially the top brass, to understand that, because it's sort of like the old joke about you want to have a baby in 1 month, so you use 9 men. But some managers have that mentality, and it just doesn't work. And that's the beauty of this. If you look at the slope of that blue line, it shows that. I really like the approach for using this as a communications with upper management.
So what about critical path methods, or identifying the critical path in these things, and then trying to mitigate and that kind of stuff? Is that anywhere in NASA's program or JCL's thought process, or is it just, hey, this is the graphic?
Sorry, but NASA, I think, if you look at that timeline of yours, they kicked PERT into touch some like 1980s or something like that, for the simple reason that there's an acknowledgement that you've done this plan, you've got this deterministic critical path running through it, but with the effect of uncertainty and then turning into risk because it affects an objective. There are a number of near-critical paths, and those near-critical paths, depending on whether the risk actually eventuates or not, then becomes critical. So was no real point, in my view, around this holding on to looking at a particular critical path and analyzing the risk around it and then doing something about it, because by the time that you've done that, guess what? The world has changed, the project has moved on, and some of your near-critical activities or near-critical paths have now become critical in the meantime because of the effect of risk. The answer, in my view, and I'm sorry, I know I suffer from confirmation bias, and I'm preaching to the converted. You know what? If you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And my job, and sorry, I love this too, but our job is to build people an approximation. We do a model. We help them so that they can have all of these bits and pieces flying at them. And I want the project manager to come up and say, wow, this is just bit us in the arse. What are we going to do? And we plug it into the model. We see what the effect is. We look at the mitigation. That is what it's all about. It's about the decision-making and the discussion. It's not about the little numbers and the little graphs and S-curves and what have you. Those are just visualizations of the discussions that we've had and the outcomes thereof. That's my view around this particular one.
Hey, Matt Kurtz.
So, Brian,
hey,
Brian.
Matt Kurtz has a chance to talk as well. Go ahead.
What Jack Fetz used to do with that critical path is he would run it. You got your iterations that you've got in the swarm here. And what Jack would do is take that and flip it back to the critical path, and he'd show managers an influence diagram where the width of the line was proportional to how many times a risk or an uncertainty hit the critical path. In other words, each of these dots in the swarm has a different critical path. So that was what Jack would do. He'd run it backwards almost to say, okay, which risks and which uncertainties are the ones that are really the ones for each of these points important, because that way you know as a project manager which ones you've got to go after and try to mitigate.
Okay. Go ahead.
I would say the piece that's jumping out at me too, and so I work for Worley Parsons, and I used to work for Chevron, so I have done quite a bit of this from both kind of the owner and the contractor side. And where I'm looking at this is almost from like in terms of a communications tool. I'd be very curious to see if a contractor and an owner would come up with the same confidence intervals if they look at different parts of the same schedule, and I could just see some really interesting discussion going on as company and contractor are going back and forth, talking about things like schedule contingency cost, where are we actually targeting? Because, I mean, all too often we see all these stories where, the project manager is trying to push the contractor, folks have misaligned views on risk, and at the end of the day, whether you take the hit now or you take it later, typically the owners take the hit when, you know, risk materializes. So I just think this is a really interesting way to get divergent groups to talk about, you know, risk and get on the same page with each other.
All right.
And I agree with my learned colleague there from Willie Potts. Actually, with the 2013 job for Gazprom was on behalf of Intec C, who was a Willie Parsons subsidiary. So that's what we did for them at that stage. It's about the discussion, and at the end of the discussion must be the objective behind that discussion, and all the analysis that we do, in my view, again, it must be to ensure that we ensure a level of decision quality. And that's what SDP, in my view, is all about at the end of the day. If we can ensure that takes place, that there's this common spaces, or the shared understanding. They call that the frontier curve. That blue curve is called the frontier curve from NASA. I just looked it up quickly. So it's all about the discussion and about that, getting that shared understanding and that shared commitment, and understanding that when it comes to projects, time and money go together. There's no getting away from that.
So any other final comments from folks? And then I want to move, I just want to spend just a minute here on the next meeting or so. I have some feedback from our Australian friend, Scott Evans, and he says, you know, if we could move this to 1:00 p.m. Pacific, so an hour later than what we had today, it would be, you know, kind of doable for him. So I was kind of trying to get some feedback whether an hour later was okay with folks. And I think it probably impacts Quentin and Noor the most.
Hey, I'm on 2100 now, so 2200 for the next meeting is no different to me. It's not a problem for me whatsoever.
Okay. Shall we try 1:00 next time? 1:00 Pacific next time? And
Sounds good to me.
okay. And so we'll keep it on. We'll keep it on this Thursday time frame. That was always the preference by people. And we will. I'll pick some dates in the future and float those by, and we'll do that. And we'll pick up the stuff we didn't cover today, and try once again extend it. You know, I'm hoping to get into maybe some of the processes, the methods used. And Jason's got. I think Jason said he's using at risk. I'm using SIPMath, and I'm sure you know the others are using other programs that they could talk more specifically about, so we have a better understanding. So, anything else people would like to chat about?
Brian, just a point of order. Can I mail that cost engineering article to you, and you can distribute to the group? I just think it's nice bedtime reading for integrated cost analysis.
All right. I have to be early bedtime for me because I normally hit the sack pretty early because I'm up so early. Okay, that would be fine. And Quentin, I want to thank you very much for participating today and making some slides available and the detailed discussion. And thank you all for your participation. And if there are others that have material they'd like to present in a similar type manner, let me know and we'll get that organized. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. We'll talk to you next.
Thank you very much, gentlemen.
Thank you.